Hi, I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin, and you're in the stream, live on Al Jazeera and on YouTube. Today, African nations are aiming to form the largest free trade bloc in more than 20 years. We examine what the deal could mean for people across the continent. Africa stands on the verge of creating the most ambitious free trade bloc since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. If ratified, the African Continental Free Trade Area would bring 55 nations under one umbrella for business. Now, the African Union hopes a final deal will supercharge trading between African nations and spur employment. Nonetheless, some member states have their reservations. Al Jazeera's Mohammed Adaw was at last week's Free Trade Summit in the Rwandan capital, Kigali.
It's estimated the African Continental Free Trade Area could see business between African nations increase by more than 50% within 4 years. The idea is to bring together countries with a combined population of 1.2 billion people and gross domestic product, or GDP, of more than $2 trillion into one market. So far, 44 of the African Union's 55 member states have signed the protocol. The agreement commits countries to removing tariffs on 90% of goods and lifting all barriers to trade within the continent. Eventually, the free movement of people and even a single currency could become part of the free trade area.
And here in our studio to discuss this, we have Professor Landry Signé. He is a fellow on the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. From the Norwegian capital, Oslo, we have Mukhtar Aynashi. He is a former advisor to the transitional federal government of Somalia. And from Boston, we have Kuskondi Abdelshafi, a Sudanese activist. He is a graduate student at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me, and with us, rather, I should say. This is obviously a very big deal. And Landry, I want to start by talking about the time frame. A lot of our online community has brought this up. 18 months to finalize the deal. Is that aspirational? Is that realistic? Why do you think this is a good deal?
I think it's an extremely important deal for many reasons. First, by 2030, Africa will has a population of about 1.7 billion people, and a combined consumer and business spending of 6.7 trillion US dollars. So it is extremely important for African countries to come together and to increase drastically intra-African trade. As you know, as of today, Africa trades more with the rest of the world than with other African countries. And this is a huge step. Of course, it still has to be successfully implemented, but we should be going step by step.
And obviously, you outlined why it's important and why it should happen. But Mukhtar, I'm curious, for your thoughts on this. You aren't as excited about the deal. Why is that?
Thank you very much for having me, Ahmed. And like I said, I'm a big fan of the show, so I'm very glad that I'm here for the first time. I do disagree with the professor, because I do believe that this agreement is not based on empirical evidence, or it is only a elite-driven political project that is going to fail. And the fact that the agreement was signed shows clearly the apparent political disconnect between the ruling elite and the poor Africans. And I believe that the elite is completely oblivious to the political and economic realities in their countries. The reason why I'm saying is because, for example, 50 years ago from today, the East African community was created. And 10 years after its creation in 1977, it was actually disbanded. And then it was reinstated in 2007, 17 years ago, roughly. And what did they do? They haven't agreed on anything. So what the African leaders are saying now is that we couldn't walk. Therefore, we want to run. And it is not going to work. And another thing is for example, Somalia and Kenyan foreign ministers were in Kigali when this agreement was signed, and they are both signatories. The two countries are both signatories in this agreement. Yet Kenya is actually erecting a physical barrier between Somalia and Kenya. So how can trade and freedom of movement be flourish while actually Kenya and other countries
well,
are
Mukhtar,
building
that's a great point. Let's come to you. What do you make of that argument there, especially the example of Somalia and Kenya? Kaskonti, what do you think?
I partly agree with what Mukhtar was saying. This is really a big step or big jump, as Landry said, but it is just the same as big as African Charter on democracy, election, and governance. The same big as African Charter on human and people's rights. The same as African Charter on youth. We are very good in the continent at creating those kind of charters, those kind of big things and nice things, but we are very lagging behind on implementing everything like this.
So how about
this charter just yesterday before signing is already big bosses are jump up. The African biggest three economy, which is South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola. Nigeria and South Africa didn't sign this charter.
Of course, I have to tell you that.
Go ahead.
I have to tell you that South Africa is planning to sign the agreement. As President Ramaphosa said, he's just waiting for the parliament to give the authorization, and he has also signed the Kigali Declaration. And for Nigeria, it will be difficult to believe that Nigeria will not join the AfCFTA for many reasons. First, President Buhari has not decided to never join the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Well, to your point, let me just jump in for a second, because I want to bring our online community into this. A lot of people discussing Nigeria and what that might mean, whether they can sign later on or not. And Mukhtar, I want you to respond to, sorry, forgive me, I want you, Laundry, to respond to what Mukhtar said about the disconnect between the people, why he thinks the deal is bad. But let's go to this tweet, AFIS, saying, I think Nigeria can still sign the agreement after consultation and understanding some terms and conditions and necessary amendments. Nigeria, as usual, being the mouthpiece of Africa, and this won't be anything different. Mukhtar, what do you think of that?
No, Ahmed, I think we have to go back a little bit before we talk about signing, because how many agreements has been signed? There are many trade blocs in Africa. You have SADC in Southern African Development Community. You have ECOWAS. You have COMESA. You have SENSAD. You have IGAD, which is basically was designed for something else, but now has been into the trade and political issues. What I am saying is, in the beginning, African leaders are saying we couldn't run, we couldn't walk, therefore we want to jump.
Well, what do you make?
These small trade blocks.
What do you make of that, Laundry? So let's let Laundry respond quickly to that. We can't run, we can't walk. He referenced all those other trade deals.
The goal of the African Continental Free Trade Area is also to address the multiple membership of African countries. Numerous countries are members of different blocs, where I think the CFTA, by centralizing, will provide a better mechanism of enforcement. So I don't think that all the solutions at the sub-regional level, so we are speaking about the RECs, the regional economic communities, I don't think that they should be perfect for us to have a CFTA. In the contrary, I think that a continental free zone area may eventually even be easier to implement because you will not have those sub-regional competitions among countries. So that is one of the important points. And also it's critical to mention that Nigeria was interested until the last minute when some of your business community leaders and some unions expressed concern. And what President Buhari said, he wants to consult and to see what will be the impact before joining. So that is different from not joining. Additionally to that, 44 countries, the 44 countries who have signed TASPA represent more than 700 million people.
Yes.
we should not neglect that fact.
No, we should not. And let's just clarify it very quickly. Before we come to you, I saw you were nodding, Kuskandi. I just want to kind of outline who is in and out. Support is at a high for the African Continental Free Trade Area in its current form. 80% of African nations have signed the agreement. Regional economic powerhouses, however, South Africa and Nigeria are among those that are withholding their signature for now, as we've been discussing, along with countries including Sierra Leone, as well as Burundi and Botswana. So with that in mind, Kuskandi, I want to bring your attention to this tweet. It kind of comments on what we heard from Landry. Just BJ saying he's disappointed to see that Nigeria is not part of the deal. It's my opinion that the government lacks the courage and willingness to improve the economy to make it competitive by providing basic amenities like electricity, water, good roads, security. They rather decided to quit. Of course, infrastructure is one of the concerns by many who are looking at this deal. What do you think, Kuskandi?
For very long, really, African interconnectedness in terms of trade and development have been an issue and an important issue. And we observe that Nigeria is one of the biggest economy, as well as others like South Africa. They are not really interested or has no ambition on investing in intra-African continental business. But that is not the problem. I don't see, as Landry say, that signing Nigeria signing or all South Africa or whatever signing on this trade agreement, it means the dream come true. That is not true. There is a lot that African countries have no problem on signing an agreement. They always have that devil that hides when they come to the details. And I'm telling you that the one of the major risks that you could see that would come out immediately, even after Nigeria might sign tomorrow or even now, South Africa might be part of it. There is a lot. There is African problem, economic problem is we have a very bad or really unworking macro and microeconomic policies.
True. And
that could make it very hard things to work. One. Two, also there is lack of political will in really creating every kind of political charter or trade charter or any kind of charter.
Okay. Let's hear from Landry.
We are seeing progress. For example, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, which was created by the NEPAD. The NEPAD itself, the New Partnership for Africa Development, was created in 2001. So by 2016, over 42 countries had signed the NEPAD Compact, and over 40 developed their investment plan. So we also have, we were speaking about infrastructure, we also have PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which is also an important initiative which is moving forward.
I appreciate you bringing the specifics up. And Mukhtar, I know you want to get in here. I do want to ask you, though, in 2006, they signed a youth charter. There was also a human rights charter, a democracy charter. And I see that, our other two guests are nodding. Don't you see that maybe aspirationally this is a good thing for Africa? It should happen for all the reasons you've outlined. But there's a lot of skepticism, this idea of how can we run if we're not walking?
I definitely think that the enforcement mechanism is extremely important, implementation. And for that, political will is important, commitment is important, sanctions for the countries which are not respecting their commitment is also important. But if we wait everything to be perfect to move forward, nothing will happen. That's why it's extremely important. To move and to make some progress?
That's certainly a great point. And Mukhtar, I want to come to you, but before I do, Matar Sonko on Twitter is chiming into this conversation saying, this deal could be an important milestone in Africa because just 16% of African countries trade with each other compared to Europe, which is 70%, and Asia, which is 51%. He says these are some challenges, including infrastructure, which has already come up in this conversation. Now, of course, Mukhtar, I know you know that the central aim of the deal is to spur intra-regional trade, and on this aspect, we all know Africa, of course, lags far behind other regions, as Landry pointed out. If we look at Europe, for example, 70% of all trade with the continent is between European nations, as the person on Twitter just mentioned. Trade between North American states, that's Mexico, Canada, and the United States, of course, stands at 55% of all trade in that region. But intra-African trade, let's look at that, lags well behind the rest of the world. Just 18% of African trade was between states on the continent in 2014. Now that's all according to the World Trade Organization. According to you, Mukhtar, how can we change those numbers? And what is another obstacle beyond what we've discussed? Is infrastructure as big a problem as this disconnect, you say, between the people and the leaders?
Indeed, that is, Ahmed, because for example, there is also a problem of capacity. What this agreement does is it can help remove some of the policy and political barriers, and perhaps some legal barriers as well. But what it doesn't address is the structural problems. What type of capacity issues exist in Africa? What can African states trade with each other? For example, in Africa, most of what Africa produces is raw material, agricultural products, and light-scale, industrial products. So what can, for example, Ghana or Nigeria trade with each other? Very little. For example, China and Africa does have a trade
on
because China has something.
Okay, let's hear Landry react to you quickly. Go ahead, very quickly.
On this extremely important point you are making, I should point out that about 42% of intra-African trade are related to manufactured goods, which means that the CFTA, which will also help accelerating the development of the manufacturing industry, contrarily to the exchange with the rest of the world, which is less than 20%.
So
I agree.
Go ahead, Kuskondi. We'll go to Kuskondi, then we'll hear from someone on Twitter, and we'll come back to you, Mukhtar. Go ahead, Kuskondi.
Yeah, the very big misleading point on all this is that we think that agreements and frameworks are the one which will make development and which can make help Africa to take its fast moving forward. And that is really a misleading point. I will tell you, the African development really need a very radical and strong change. That change should be really visionary. If you don't have a vision on expanding and industrializing the economy, and it's still being a raw material producing country, a country that have 70% or 60% of young people who are useless and working, what can you trade, even if you agree? It is just, maybe it is opening a new market for China to import toothpicks. You have countries that import toothpicks in a bush and do business. So I think in another aspect, maybe if this agreement just signed 40%,
again, on this point.
Okay, Kuskondi, I'm going to give him a quick moment to react. And
again, on this point, it is important to highlight the fact that the CFTA is likely to increase diversification, industrialization, productivity, and economic complexity. By constituting a bloc, Africa will be likely to respond and better negotiate with international partners, the European Union, the United States, China. So the point where I agree with you is leaders should focus on removing all the barriers to industrial development, to manufacturing, the cost of doing business. They should invest in human capital, among other factors.
Well, Kuskondi, I'm going to come to you, Mukhtar, but Mukhtar, go ahead. But actually, I just want to point out, we're going to run out of time before I get to a lot of things I want to talk about. So I'm going to let you speak, Mukhtar, but then I do want to talk about infrastructure and freedom of movement and how that's a problem. Go ahead, Mukhtar, quickly.
That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Ahmed. My point is there are structural problems in terms of transportation. For example, sometimes if you want to fly from Somalia to, for example, maybe Ivory Coast, you have to go through Europe or through Asia. And sending a letter or a package to other African countries might go through Europe or even America.
Mukhtar, you are not the only person who thinks that's true, and I know you see this as a problem. In fact, I want to share with our audience someone else who's saying the same thing you do, and then I'll let you complete your point and say what the fact is, because we do know that there are key barriers to, not only flexible trading in Africa, but key barriers in terms of the lack of direct air routes we just heard Mukhtar mention. For example, in January, 23 African states signed on to a single air market, but there were 32 others that have yet to agree. One person actually told Al Jazeera's Tanya Page exactly this, the kinds of problems he faces when flying. Take a look.
Flying in Africa is a nightmare. I went to Tanzania 2 weeks ago. But to get to Tanzania, I have to take 3 different flights, and I could not believe. When I fly to France, after 10 hours is a straight flight, I land in France. I'm in another continent.
Mukhtar, what is the fact? What do you make of that? And what point were you making?
Thank you, Ahmed. My point is, I am not against the idea of having a trade agreement. Actually, I'm for it. But what I am saying is the regional trade blocks didn't work. I think what we should concentrate and what African leaders should concentrate now is to make those trade blocks work first and then draw lessons from them. And once that happens and we have sufficient empirical data to support the continuation of those trade blocks, regional trade blocks, then we can come to the larger issue of having an African trade bloc. But we are jumping to a bigger issue while we cannot actually solve a small problem. So that is where the discontent is. And that is where the African ruling elite are actually far apart from what is happening in their own countries, politically and economically.
And Landry, you know, obviously there's something we haven't discussed, which is, and perhaps it's not because we're 4 gentlemen here speaking about an entire continent. You know, I wish we could have had a woman join us because we had a community member who sent us a video that actually brings up a very good point. They raised a point about a trade deal, about how this trade deal, I should say specifically, could actually impact the lives of cross-border traders who actually, most of whom are women. Take a listen.
The main cross-border trade is informal, and the majority of informal traders are women at 70%. Yet they face specific and acute challenges. The CFTA provides a window of opportunity, not only to boost trade, but to improve the spread of its benefits, advance human rights, and tackle poverty. For this to happen, it must be alive to the challenges facing women in trade and respond by ensuring women's participation, giving them information, providing resources, and equipping them with the necessary skills.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay,
I couldn't agree more.
Tell me why.
For different reasons, one of which is by lifting barriers, women's small entrepreneurs will not have to hide anymore. It will help formalizing the economy. They will not have to pay bribes when crossing the border because they will have the right to do so. So it will be a progress for small entrepreneurs.
Kuscondi?
I see that, like, particularly that might be possible, as the video said, the voice said, that it will open opportunity. But I'm looking this with another aspect, that really not only that, this opening trade and formalization could be an issue to terminate those small business. This will open a window for big men to come in with their big brother China. And really, these women that are benefiting right now will never have a chance anymore. And looking at it in even issues of human rights that you are talking, this could be really an issue that could really...
So you know, we just lost the connection there, I think, but I want to come to you, Mukhtar, very quickly, because what you were talking about, Kuscondi, is a very important point, and a lot of people are outlining the freedom of movement as an issue. Dylan Mwanza saying, we are not ready for this deal. Free movement, border on security. East and West Africa have a lot to deal with in terms of terrorism. This will just endanger everyone on the continent. Very quickly, Mukhtar, terrorism, something we haven't discussed, a problem?
Yeah, actually, terrorism is a huge problem in the African continent, especially in East Africa, where we have Al-Shabaab and IS. And I mentioned earlier in my remarks that Kenya is actually erecting a physical wall between Somalia and itself. And their rationale is that we're trying to block Al-Shabaab is entering into our country. And I do understand that. But
well,
however, I do believe there is some hypocrisy.
Mukhtar, I have to cut you off there, forgive me. There is always some hypocrisy, sadly, when we discuss these things. But I do want to point out Ngosa saying, watching AJ stream and I want to smash the screen. I hate that analogy. We want to run before we can walk with regards to the trade deal. That is old school thinking. Youth are ready to fly. Stop holding us back. Maybe aspirational, but You know, I think we should end on a positive note, and from a woman no less. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. That is all from us today here at The Stream. Be sure to keep the comments and suggestions coming on YouTube and Twitter, and of course at aljazeera.com/thestream.